Hello and welcome to Teaching for the Whole Self. Hello, my name is Sandra. I'm a white, middle-class, middle-aged, able-bodied, non-binary, transdisciplinary scholar from Brock University, Canada. My previous research has involved the breaking down of binaristic thinking and resolving dualisms, including reason and emotion, which I will talk about again today when challenging Cartesian dualism. Objectives of this teaching module are to discover what exactly is the whole self and what elements are involved, and how we can use this knowledge in our teaching. But before we can truly shift to whole self teaching, there are some obstacles that need challenging. For example, before we can understand holism and the dynamic, fluid interactions between complex systems, we need to dismantle Cartesian dualism, reductionism, and materialism. Teaching for the whole self is not a new concept, but paradigm shifting to this whole self teaching is slow. There are many definitions of what it means to teach for the whole self, and pedagogies involving this teaching have different understandings of what this means. For the purposes of this presentation, my operational definition of whole self teaching is to understand that students need to grow and learn in their relationships, identity, emotional understanding, and overall well-being, because they are multidimensional whole beings whose development is complex and rich. Therefore, the whole self is a dynamic, complex system full of relationships, not a linear fixed box in a vacuum. In order to teach for the whole self, one must first understand what the whole self actually is, and must also have an understanding of complex systems theory and its interactions. Felton and Lambert state that relationships are integral to the teaching and learning experience and are flexible and adaptable. Therefore, relational thinking is compatible with dynamic interactions involved in complex systems theory, which is a major theoretical framework here. This type of thinking, however, seems to be incompatible with standard traditional teaching practices that have positive ontologies and epistemologies, which could explain the slow shift to whole self teaching. This presentation will explore the disconnect between traditional and whole self teaching by working through some obstacles slowing down this shift, explore what constitutes the whole self, and how we can apply contemporary understandings of complex self in our teaching. The first part will challenge Cartesian dualism and explore elements that constitute a whole self. Using Cartesian dualism's definition of self as a springboard, I will discuss many other complex systems involved in the whole self and show that there are more types of intelligence than just math and verbal. Since Cartesian dualism and traditional understandings of self are outdated and incompatible with complex systems theories and quantum physics, the next part will discuss some complex systems theories and use them to falsify reductionism. When exploring quantum systems, materialism is also falsified. The last section will discuss this new definition of whole self and how we can apply it to the classroom. For example, does new understanding of whole self change our definition of intelligence? How might this produce different ways of teaching? And how might this create new ways for students to express their learned knowledge? So basically, what is the whole self? What constitutes the whole self? What are some obstacles slowing down the shift to whole self teaching? And how can we apply contemporary understandings of the whole self in our teaching? Cartesian dualism is one obstacle I think is slowing down the shift to whole self teaching. Prout and James state that Cartesian dualism is so entrenched in the dominant framework that it has yet to be overcome in the social sciences. I say, challenge accepted. Cartesian dualism came out of the Age of Enlightenment, where superiority of reason suppressed and devalued emotion. The simple conclusion Descartes came to regarding knowing he's a thinking being seems to place the mind in a superior position to emotion by subsuming it into the functions of the mind. This has since produced a hierarchical ontology, assuming the mind to be more real or more important than other aspects of the human experience. Cartesian dualism paints a picture of the whole self as only a mind and body interaction, and consequently produces a limited binaristic definition of intelligence that only sees math and verbal skills as important. Here I argue that this picture of self is not a whole picture. Instead, I suggest that the individual whole self consists of a negotiation or relationship between body, mind, and emotion. Right away, this notion challenges Cartesian dualism. Using Paul MacLean's Triune brain theory, I trouble Cartesian dualism by adding emotion as a third substance. The Triune brain theory looks at an evolutionary or developmental progression of the brain, beginning with the reptilian brain, which is focused on basic needs for the body, like eat, sleep, sex, etc. On top of that grows the paleo-mammalian brain, or the emotional center, followed by the neo-mammalian brain, or the cortex, which is in charge of the rational capacities. The cortex is considered by some not to finish developing until the early to mid-20s. Both Freud and MacLean agree that the mind, or ego, develops last. If the rational mind develops last, then it's actually younger, newer, and less experienced than the other parts of the brain, which are more established. Freud saw the ego as a mediator and ultimate decider that needs to tame the other parts of the brain. The rational mind is still on this pedestal and kept there by traditional dominant understandings of teaching and learning. Instead, I suggest that through Paul MacLean's Triune brain theory, we should be able to conceptualize the brain as overseeing three equally important elements: basic needs for the body, or body functions, emotions, and rational capacities. It is important to understand that each aspect is equally valid, and each have their own influence over the individual. Therefore, I argue that all three aspects have their own type of consciousness. According to Descartes, in order for something to be considered real and have its own level of consciousness, it must show it has causal influences. He calls this the causal argument. The causal argument states that if a substance can cause observable effects such as behavior, then it can be considered real. So for the other parts of the brain to be considered as real as the rational mind, their reality must be determined through this causal argument. The other parts of the brain do cause observable effects, such as behavior, because an action may arise without rational awareness. For example, an individual may hear rustling in the bushes and start running. The person may not know why they're running or what they're running away from, because the mind hasn't caught up yet. Only later do they realize it was a chipmunk or something. The flight response may have come from the brain, but not from the ego or rational mind, which is how Descartes defines mind. Therefore, the motivational or id aspect of the brain must be able to bypass the rational capacities to communicate directly with the sensory motor cortex in order to initiate fight or flight mode. Therefore, the reptilian brain can produce observable effects such as fight or flight. An example how the heart can initiate actions and send signals to the brain is through recent pain studies and experiments. For example, Al-Shami discusses that more signals actually come from the heart to the brain rather than the other way around, and states that the heart communicates with the brain in many methods, including neurobiologically, biochemically, biophysically, and energetically. According to this article, the vagus nerve is the mechanism that carries information from the heart and the other internal organs to the brain. Armour found that there were approximately 40,000 neurons in the heart, similar to those in the brain, and says that the heart's like a little brain with its own nervous system. Eisenberger presents similar research that states that physical and social pain rely on shared neurobiological substrates that both share neural activity in regions typically associated with the unpleasant experiences of physical pain. He calls this piggybacking. Therefore, if physical and emotional pain share neural pathways, then the body, mind, and emotion may be more interconnected and relational than previously thought. In a relational system, directional causality is impossible to determine. So instead of a Cartesian way of looking at the ego as acting on and dominating the other parts of the brain, there's maybe a correlational relationship between the parts where the influence is multidirectional. This renders ideas of ontological superiority of one part of the brain over another meaningless. Shioda et al. State that an emotional response to perceptually vast stimuli can overwhelm current mental structures. Therefore, this research suggests emotional capacities can override mental machinations. Some observable effects of awe include a reduced need for cognitive evaluation and an increased emphasis on membership in universal categories. If an emotion can cause observable effects such as those mentioned above, emotions therefore should be considered as real or as important as reason. Sheldrick states that the importance of deconstructing binaristic thinking, like body-mind dualism, is important, and to instead think of categories as fluid, which I will be talking a lot about. He states that emotion and affect are just as important as the material aspects of life. Therefore, using Descartes' causal argument against him, the motivational and emotional aspects of the brain can be considered as real as the rational mind because they both cause observable effects and influence behavior. Recent research in posthumanism discusses transjectivity, which is a term describing the transcendence of the distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, which is, according to Sweeney, a term attempting to overcome the trauma of Cartesian dualism. So take that, Cartesian dualism. Relating this to our teaching, if emotionality or emotional intelligence is an equally valid agent in the negotiation of the human experience, then the arts should have equal footing with verbal and mathematical intelligence. But classes that teach art and music are still considered less important and even expendable when it comes to funding. If emotional intelligence and art are equally important, why are they still not valued? Why did they take a back burner to verbal and math? Is this how you define intelligence, is just verbal and math? What would a classroom activity look like that tapped into emotional intelligence? Body, mind, and emotion, however, are not only part of the self, and it's not a fixed, stable construct. This is because the inner self, or the basic self, I sometimes call it, interacts with the outside world via the context, which can produce different levels or experiences where one aspect may be more salient than another. In other words, the context can make one aspect more highlighted or useful depending on the situation. Therefore, the context needs to fit into the negotiations between body, mind, and emotion as well, making the self fluid and contextual. For example, regarding disability, Rosie, a girl with autism, was not seen as disabled when at home because the social anxiety and street noise was not a threatening factor there. Likewise, a blind person is not considered disabled while talking on the phone. Therefore, disability and identity are provisional rather than marking a fixed identity. Identity and self are a relationship that is relative to the environment. A person with disabilities may identify more with their body in a situation where accessibility is an issue. Perhaps emotion is more useful at a funeral. And yeah, perhaps reason is more useful for problem solving. It is the context that makes one of these things or two of these things more salient than another, not necessarily more ontological, real, or superior. Therefore, contextualism is an important facet in understanding the complex system that is the whole self. Contextualism is the worldview that suggests events or elements take their meaning from the context in which they are embedded. These contexts are not fixed, but are variable and subject to manipulation and reconstruction. Therefore, the borders and boundaries of things such as people and their environment are fuzzy. The whole self is dynamic, fluid, and contextual, making the classroom an important context that can influence the negotiation of identity and self. If the classroom is an important context, then how do we incorporate contextualism into the classroom? The answer to this might be to use a relational approach to teaching. Research states that in education, relationships matter. Taking a relational approach to teaching realizes that teaching and learning are not directional or a one-way interaction. Like the communication between the three layers of the brain, the classroom learning is also multidirectional. Traditionally, students and teachers are separated by the idea that teachers teach and students learn. But if Feldman is correct and teaching is a way of being, then interactions become an important focus. Ketcherman suggests that the teacher's personal interpretive framework is constantly modified in interactions between students and teachers. Relational learning, however, extends beyond the classroom and includes relationships between faculty, peers, staff, and they all come together to foster whole self. When students have positive interactions with other members of the university community, it increases the breadth and depth of student learning, retention, and graduate rates, with the wide range of other outcomes including critical thinking, identity development, communication skills, and leadership abilities. Whole self teaching does not end in the classroom. Therefore, we may need to add more systems to the whole self equation. Yes, body, mind, emotion, context, and relational interactions are still not the only elements involved in the whole self. Intersectionality is also a facet that should be taken into consideration in our teaching. Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group. It has been argued that the idea of intersectionality has been colonized because white researchers and teachers who use the term fail to put its use into context or ignore its originator, Kimberly Crenshaw. Therefore, a note to teachers is that when teaching intersectionality, one should highlight the complications and struggles of Black women's oppression through policy, law, and work, because intersectionality creates overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage, depending on the context or the classroom. Therefore, intersectional experiences of the self also vary in salience according to the situation. For example, Sundar discusses identity capital, which is a strategic negotiation of identity that is dependent on the situation. In her interviews with Asian Canadian youth, in some situations like a dominant mainstream setting, it was better to bring down the brown to gain social acceptance. But in other situations like a family wedding, it was better to brown it up. This research supports the idea that identity is fluid. Therefore, negotiating identity via the situation, one can gain the most out of whatever situation they are in, showing the powerful influence of context and the powerful influence of the classroom. So far, the answer to the question, what is the whole self, is a multi-directional interaction between body, mind, emotion, context, and intersectionality. But yes, the definition of whole self still doesn't even end there. There is still society, or the social world, which includes systems of power such as economy, politics, bureaucracy, traditions, etc. Institutions of power influence the whole self due to barriers of discrimination, patriarchy, prejudice, etc. And this also affects access to schooling. There's also the physical environment, which includes weather, barometric pressure, etc. I know some people, if the barometric pressure is high that day, they're out. They're not themselves at all. So therefore, you can see that the social systems and the physical environment do affect identity and self, and even your ability to do things or learn that day. Now that we've added these major worlds of the social world and the physical environmental world, we're starting to shape up to a definition of the self. So if the whole self is a multi-directional interaction between body, mind, emotion, context, relational, intersectional, demographics, social systems, and the environment, then the best definition for the whole self is that it is a dynamic, complex system. This is where an understanding of complex systems theories becomes useful. In a teaching context, when discussing systems theory, the most well-known is probably that of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which discusses an interaction between the individual, their family, their friends, their teachers, strangers in the community, influencers such as politicians, and even time and history. Considering the definition of whole self that is shaping up here, I thought Bronfenbrenner's model could use a little updating to include context, intersectionality, and the natural physical environment. I even added the solar system for those who believe in astrological effects on identity and self. Since this theory is probably the most well-known, I'll skip to other systems theories. Other types of systems theories include complex system theory, also known as nonlinear dynamical systems approach, which postulates an interconnected nested system of reality where system and subsystems interact. This paradigm argues that these systems can change the context for all other elements involved. This supports the idea of identity as fluid and dynamic and contextual, whereas each system and characteristic can change salience according to the situation. Levy states transdisciplinary modes of knowledge production have come in a response to a demand for more unified and holistic understandings, which supports the idea of whole self teaching. Therefore, understanding the power of context and fluidity is key to paradigm shifting from binaries to complex systems. But we cannot fully make this transition without first falsifying reductionism. Another obstacle for holistic teaching is reductionism. Reductionism is the theory that every complex phenomenon, especially in biology or psychology, can be explained by analyzing the simplest, most basic physical mechanisms that are in operation during the phenomenon. So, for example, the idea that this behavior can be explained by this neuron or this part of the brain. It is also the practice of simplifying a complex idea, issue, condition, or the like to the point of minimizing, obscuring, or distorting it. So therefore, it creates unrepresentative data. This stance maintains that the sum of the parts can equal the whole. General systems theory, which is the parent of all systems theories, can be used to show that the sum of the parts do not equal the whole. According to general systems theory, the various branches of science grew so far apart they could no longer communicate. The only way the different branches of science could communicate was to develop a theory they could all agree on. Scientists eventually agreed that there was such a thing as a system, and proceeded to create two hypothetical systems as starting points on a continuum. On the one hand is the purely open system, and on the other is the purely closed system. These are hypothetical because they cannot exist in the physical world. For example, every part in the purely open system communicates equally, at the same time, and intensity, which would end up crashing the system. In the purely closed system, none of the parts communicate. This is also not possible in the physical world. In a hypothetical, purely closed system, however, the concept of reductionism is possible. But only in a purely closed system can the sum of the parts actually equal the whole, because there's no novel or new information being created, because there's no communication between the parts. So as soon as one part of a system communicates with another, reductionism is impossible, or will create distorted results. General systems theory can therefore be used to falsify reductionism, because reductionism can only happen in a hypothetical situation. Speaking of hypothetical situations and what becomes manifest in the physical world, research in quantum physics shows us that the world is not a predictable, fixed, closed system, but rather a probability distribution. David Bohm calls this probability distribution the quantum potential or structure process, which is the process where all possibilities lie awaiting potential until we make a choice. And this is how the person fits into this conversation. Because when the person makes a choice, the whole universe collapses into that one thing. It's kind of cool, actually. So this is particle wave dualism. If everything is interconnected and part of a dynamic process involving interlocking systems and forces, then a person, a student, or a teacher cannot separate themselves from these interconnections. Therefore, if our experience lies in infinite potential, what does this say about standardized classroom lessons that assume one size fits all? Are the teacher's lesson and the student's learning mutually exclusive? This brings us to the quantum self. Barad discusses the importance of dynamic processes and her concept of intra-action. Intra-action is the agentic process involving an entangled web of negotiations. She states that intra-action signifies the mutual constitution of entangled agencies, which is in contrast to the usual interaction that assumes there are separate individual agencies that precede their interaction. This is consistent with post-humanist understandings, where all things, humans, non-human animals, the environment, and objects are all entangled negotiators in the meta-negotiation of agency and choice. This negotiation includes variables such as history, materiality, body, culture, nature, thus creating active dynamic agency, making agency, like identity, also fluid and dynamic and situational. Post-humanist understandings of complex systems place an emphasis on mutual entanglement or entangled processes involved in agency. If all things are intertwined practices of knowing and becoming, then the teacher and the student are entangled in the fluid dynamic negotiation of teaching and learning. Posthumanism would take this a step further and say that the teacher or the professor is not the only creator in the teaching space, but the students and even the objects in the room, such as the clock on the wall, are all co-creators in that space. In quantum physics, there is also a divide between traditional dominant understandings and marginalized ones. For example, the traditional Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics keeps the observer solely in the material realm, creating a hierarchical ontology or distinction, making the material world more real than the quantum realm. Therefore, this position keeps the myth of materialism alive because it believes that the standard model, which are the particles and the strong and weak electromagnetic forces, are more real than the structure process or the quantum potential of the quantum realm. However, the many worlds interpretation sees the process as the most real or the most representative of reality, making the quantum realm and the material worlds equal and promoting the universe as a dynamic process, a relational, multi-directional process, rather than assuming ontological superiority of one realm over another. This is more consistent with decoherence theories of quantum physics that state that realistic quantum systems are never isolated, but are immersed in the surrounding environment and interact continuously with it. Systems theories and whole self teaching allows us to expand our expectations of learning and opens up to new types of thinking. There are three major types of thinking: convergent, divergent, and lateral. Convergent thinking uses logic and critical thinking to solve problems and is more linear and systematic. This type of thinking is the standard type of thinking promoted by traditional teaching methods because it can narrow many possibilities to one solution. There seems to be such a focus on this type of thinking that it's assumed to be the best or most ontologically superior way to think. For example, like the arts, philosophical thinking is marginalized and considered not a practical avenue for learning, partly because it promotes divergent thinking, which uses imagination to generate creative ideas and can explain many solutions to one problem. There's usually more than one solution to a problem. This type of thinking uses indirect and creative approaches via reasoning that are not immediately obvious and can be spontaneous. Then there's the type of thinking that utilizes both of these. This is called lateral thinking. This way, if you use both of them, then it would negate any ontological superiority or distinction. This is the one I like because why does everything have to fit in a box, and why doesn't everything have to be in a binary? See, this is the damage of binaristic thinking. Now we have three things, one that combines the two. So opposites are not mutually exclusive. I wonder what classroom activities would look like that tapped at all of these types of thinking. As well as different types of thinking, there are also different types of intelligence. You've probably heard of Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory, where he proposes 9 different types of intelligence, including logical, mathematical, verbal, linguistic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, musical, visual, spatial, body kinesthetic, naturalist, and existential types of intelligence. Thinking back, I was not taught naturalist type of intelligence, which is a sensitivity to features in the natural world and a strong appreciation for the environment. Geez, maybe if this type of intelligence was fostered earlier and more often, we wouldn't be in a climate crisis. I'm wondering if existential and naturalist intelligence wasn't taught because they're type of emotional intelligences, which were considered inferior. I know that if one wanted to pursue music, they could specialize in music or dance or environmental studies. But what if students were allowed to hand in other types of material rather than just essays and exams? In courses like sociology or psychology or history, for example. Essays and exams seem to be the dominant measure of intelligence, which may not tap into these other types. I wonder what a rubric would look like that measured different types of material, such as a song or an interpretive dance or a poem or a short film, against a formal essay. Perhaps it would look something like this, like from World of Dance. They had to judge different types of dance against one another and came up with this rubric with these items, and then I've added some that might include how we would incorporate an essay into it. In conclusion, the whole self is a multi-directional interaction between body, mind, emotion, context, intersectionality, various social systems, the environment, and quantum processes. In other words, a complex system. And the context dictates which aspects are more useful or salient, not more important or ontologically superior. Therefore, whole self teaching requires an understanding of what the whole self is, a paradigm shift from traditional teachings based on outdated concepts such as Cartesian dualism, reductionism, and materialism, to an incorporation of contextualism, complex systems theories, and multiple intelligences. Thank you.